Chapter 6. Mr. de Salzmann met Mr. Gurdjieff and our pupils at the Paris station. My wife and I were taken by my wife's cousin, a very wealthy Frenchman, to his villa in Neuilly. It was the last word in comfort. 2 beautiful rooms with baths were prepared for us. We were entertained in the finest restaurants and theaters, and shown around Paris. After so many years of privations and restrictions, to have such comfort was as if Mr. Gurdjieff himself had created this luxury and rest for us. After a few days, our hosts went away to their summer villa in Marly, and we remained in their beautiful house, feeling absolutely free to enjoy it. But very soon we were both given tasks by Mr. Gurdjieff. My wife was told to find a property near Paris with a very large house and grounds. I was given another task, to find Mr. Gurdjieff a pied-à-terre in the center of Paris, 1 room with a kitchen and bathroom and a separate entrance. After a long search, I was finally told by an agency that they had such a small apartment in the Rue Miromesnil, but they could not give me the number unless I paid a deposit. I could not do this because I had no money. However, I already knew the street and had time to spare, so I decided to visit every house in the Rue Miromesnil. At the 10th house, the concierge told me that she had just the kind of apartment I was looking for. It even had a telephone. I was overwhelmed with joy because it was then practically impossible to find any kind of room in Paris. I flew to Mr. Gurdjieff and told him that I had found an apartment with everything he needed. He listened to me very indifferently and then asked, "Is there a gas stove?" I had not thought to look, but how revolting of him, I thought, to ask about such a trifle instead of being thankful for what I had found. The lesson here was not to lose one's head, to control attention even while one is feeling great satisfaction. This was Mr. Gurdjieff's way of thanking me for having found the apartment. People from London began to arrive, and, in order to keep them together and have constant contact with them, Mr. Gurdjieff rented several apartments on Rue Michel-Ange. He had purchased all kinds of material, thread, needles, scissors, thimbles, and a sewing machine. He himself cut out different kinds of costumes for the struggle of the magicians, and everyone who was able helped to make them. There was no philosophical conversation, just sewing. For the English people who came through Mr. Ouspensky's lectures, this was something new, but everyone worked, even those who were not at all well acquainted with the ideas. One of Mr. Gurdjieff's pupils, Madame H., the choreographer of the Paris Opera, who also gave lessons in the Dalcroze school, was able to arrange for us to use a room in the school for exercises. This made it possible not only to continue with sacred dances and gymnastics, but also to work there on costumes and on painting the material by hand or with a sprayer. One day we learned that a beautifully furnished house, which was just what we needed, had been found by my wife at Fontainebleau, 40 miles from Paris. We did not believe it. It would be possible to purchase it because the price was high. Mr. Gurdjieff decided, nevertheless, to buy the property without even having seen it, the Prieuré of Avon. Mr. Gurdjieff gave my wife the task of arranging the terms with the owner. In Berlin, he had begun to train her as his secretary and assistant, speaking with her at the same time about ideas and inner work. He taught her how to keep attention alert, how to develop memory, and how to try, in all circumstances, to remember herself. He now told her how to act with Madame Laborie, the owner of the Prieuré, to hold in mind at all times what she wished to get from her, and not for a single moment to lose this thought, even though the conversation might turn to other subjects. Such advice from Mr. Gurdjieff was like gold to those who really tried to work with him. It was necessary to find 1,000,000 francs to buy the Prieuré. This property belonged to the widow of a famous lawyer, Laborie, who had defended and liberated Dreyfus. As payment, the Dreyfus family had given the Prieuré to him. The house was a remodeled mansion of the 17th or 18th century that once had been a monastery for priors, so it was called the Prieuré. The rumor was that it had once been the residence of Madame de Montaignan. Meanwhile, my wife had to persuade Madame Laborie to rent it for a year with the option to buy and to send her gardener away, so that Mr. Gurdjieff might have the feeling of full possession. My wife succeeded in getting Madame Laborie to agree to all these conditions. Although the big house was occupied, we were able to visit it. We were especially delighted with the beautiful view of the fountains from one of the salons, and with the unusual lane of linden trees. At the same time, a few of our people came to live in Paradou, a smaller empty house on the property. All the British people went to live in hotels in Fontainebleau, but spent the whole day with us. One day after supper, when Mr. Gurdjieff was with us in the Paradou, he asked if it were possible to remove the table from the dining room. The young men did so at once. There was an upright piano, and immediately the dervish movements and the obligatories began, and then all the exercises that had been done in Tiflis, Constantinople, and Berlin. Soon the big house was vacated, and we were able to explore it. The first impression was of great elegance, but not of comfort. There was only one bathroom in the whole house. Happily, the water came from our own private spring, one of the conditions on which my wife firmly insisted. On the ground floor there was a long hall hung with paintings and an elegant dining room. On the right there was a reception room, further on a library with bookcases in Jacobean style, and still further a large drawing room where there was a Pleyel concert grand piano. This was no battered old Tiflis piano. Everything comes to him who knows how to wait, and with Mr. Gurdjieff it was always so. Beyond the drawing room was the study of the former owner, and near it a beautiful billiard room, but we never had a chance to play because Mr. Gurdjieff quickly ordered the table sold. He at once christened the second floor the Ritz, the name of the most luxurious and expensive hotel in Paris, and the first room on the left side was his own. Next came several rooms with beautiful antique furniture and French engravings. Catherine Mansfield died in one of these rooms. Our room was on the third floor, which we called the Monk's Corridor. Adjacent to the main house was a large wing with a big kitchen and dining room on the ground floor, where we always had our meals. On its second floor were rooms for the English and Russian people, who little by little came to the Prieuré. In the back courtyard there were stables, a garage, and a cowshed, where a special balcony was built, whose walls and ceiling were decorated by Mr. D. S. There Mr. Gurdjieff often rested. He told Catherine Mansfield to lie there and inhale the air, which was so beneficial for her lungs. Our everyday life started. At 6 in the morning, when one of the pupils ran through the corridors with a little bell, we had to get up quickly, go down to the dining room, hastily drink coffee with a small piece of bread, and go straight to work. Mr. Gurdjieff knew how to distribute work among people in such a way that not a moment was lost. Sometimes he would call men and women for a special task and say, "Throw everyone into the work," and a big job would be done in a few hours. Outside work continued from morning until 7 in the evening or until dark, with a break for lunch. Mr. Gurdjieff looked unfavorably on anyone who sat very long in the dining room, smoking or talking. Then, when the big bell rang, everyone went to a dinner of meat with beans or peas or potatoes, coffee and bread. We had to change quickly from work clothes into clean suits and dresses. At 8 o'clock we had to be in the drawing room where Mr. Gurdjieff sometimes spoke and where sacred gymnastics took place. Mr. Gurdjieff invented new, not very complicated exercises, all connected with developing attention. There were, for example, 3 different simultaneous movements for head, arms, and legs, with counting. These marvelous combinations occupied the whole of one's attention, and the mechanical flow of associations ceased to bother one. Mr. Gurdjieff spoke to us quite often in the evenings when we gathered in the drawing room. He told us, for instance, that he would give us work for the emotional center, but nobody seemed to understand what he meant, and to me and some others this seemed strange. But the following day I understood, when as a result of some awkwardness of mine, he called me balda, which means stupid. This wounded me very deeply, and the feeling did not pass for some time. But that same evening Mr. Gurdjieff told me, "So, Thomas, today you also got something." I realized that work on feeling had begun and that all my oppressive emotions vanished. I saw again that if I began to boil with anger, my task was to struggle with it internally and not to manifest it. In connection with this, Mr. Gurdjieff once told me that one should never be resentful of such comments in work, but to consider them a healing medicine. However, the art with which Mr. Gurdjieff brought us this pain was so great, his mask so well assumed, that in spite of our having decided in advance not to react and remembering that it was being done to help us, when the experience took place, we were quite sure that there stood before us a cold and even a cruel man. We were outraged, and, against our will, protests exploded like gunshot. Mr. Gurdjieff's face would at once begin to change. He resumed his usual expression, but looked very sad and would walk away without a single word. We were then consumed by a feeling of terrible dissatisfaction with ourselves. We had forgotten, not remembered, why we came here and had reacted in an unsuitable way. Every activity in the work showed clearly that the aim was never for outer results, but for the inner struggle. For example, Mr. Gurdjieff once sent everyone to prepare the earth for the kitchen garden, but later the garden was abandoned. Very often he said that he was in a hurry to finish one or another job, and that we had to do it as quickly as possible. I must say that this pressure to finish was always a stimulant, but this very stimulant provoked in a kind of unconscious provoked in us a kind of unconscious identification. I remember Mr. Gurdjieff saying, identification, identification, meaning that we had become completely absorbed in the task. But at other times he showed us that when we really work, we have to identify while leaving a little bit of attention with which to observe ourselves. On the other hand, Mr. Gurdjieff observed closely how we worked and never permitted us to overdo. Once, when I was doing something very strenuous, which was probably too much for my heart, he said unexpectedly, "Toma, now go and burn some leaves." The drawing room at the Prieuré was not big enough for our activities, so almost immediately after our arrival we started to prepare a place to build a big hall in the grounds. Mr. Gurdjieff succeeded in buying, for practically nothing, the skeleton of a French Air Force hangar, and two big trucks soon brought it in sections. Everything was unloaded in one big heap, and we began to put it together. Quite a puzzle for inexperienced people. After the framework was set up, a roof was made of thin planks covered with tar paper. The walls were planks, and the spaces between them were filled with dry leaves mixed with earth and clay. We had plenty of clay because, in leveling the ground for this hall, we had removed much earth. As usual, nothing was lost. When we began building, Mr. Gurdjieff gave orders to leave a definite space between each section of the hangar, and soon we saw why. He ordered the windows removed from an old hothouse in the garden, and these windows were just the size of the spaces left. The glass was painted under the supervision of Mr. de Saltzman, who also decorated some himself with beautiful designs in the manner of antique Persian carpets. At one end of the hall there was a section of raised floor, and there the future platform for sacred gymnastics was prepared. Although cold weather had set in, we continued building. We had no proper tools and worked practically with our bare hands. I had to work with a lot of cement, not knowing that it ruins the skin, and when I played the piano later, it felt as though I were playing on needles. When roof, doors, and windows were installed, we had a closed building. There, large iron stoves were set up, so we were able to continue working in a heated place. But there was still a great problem, the removal of the center pole which supported the entire framework of the ceiling. Mr. Gurdjieff told my wife to remain near the door, for this was a crucial moment in every sense. He said, "When the pole is removed, the house will either stand or collapse." It stood. Then the cloth which was to drape the ceiling had to be put in place. It was white material on which aphorisms had been painted and embroidered. All the women had worked on it. The material was spread on the floor, and Mr. Gurdjieff showed exactly where the writing was to be inserted. This was in a special script which he had taught us. When the material was lifted up and the four corners and the centers were fastened, they fitted exactly, although everything had been worked on upside down. Against the side walls we built high benches with footrests. These were the seats for the guests who were later permitted to come on Saturdays to watch the sacred gymnastics and sacred dances, which now are called movements, as the word gymnastics did not have the right meaning in France. In front of these benches there was a space separated from the central area of the hall by a wooden grillwork. When it was finished, we painted it in Oriental style. Above it there hung small electric lamps with red shades, a yard apart. At the north entrance of the hall there was a kind of box, as in a theater. hung on three sides with curtains. That was Mr. Gurdjieff's place. The whole floor was covered with oriental carpets, and the platform for movements with linoleum. In the central area, along the grill work, mattresses, covered with small carpets and goatskins, were placed where the pupils were to sit separated by bolsters. The places on the right were for men, those on the left for women. We, we had not dreamed how quickly the study house would create the impression of a mosque, not a temple, but a house for study, for definite inner work. Towards the end, we worked from 6:30 in the morning all through the day, but a lot would still remain to be done. Once, when night fell, we continued to work hour after hour until, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Gurdjieff sent for coffee with milk and bread for us. We gathered fresh strength, and the work continued in the same rhythm. Time for morning coffee arrived. It was brought to the hall. Time for lunch arrived. It also was brought to the hall. Work continued with the same intensity. The last nail was finally driven at 7 o'clock in the evening. Then we had supper, went to bed, and Mr. Gurdjieff permitted us to sleep as long as we wished. The study house decoration was completed in December 1922. Later, two mechanical fountains with changeable lighting were installed not far from the dais. Mr. Gurdjieff occasionally scented them with oriental perfume. When the main lights were switched off, and the study house, with its rugs and Eastern ornaments, was bathed in a dim glow from the little red lights and the illuminated fountains, Mr. Gurdjieff often asked me to play the Essentuki prayer. The pupils, led by my wife, hummed the melody. All this created an unforgettable impression. While the study house was being built, Mr. Gurdjieff also began the construction of a Turkish bath. He had taken us occasionally for a bath in Tiflis and Constantinople, so we knew what real Turkish baths were like. One of their attractions had been a special clay which, when spread on the body, removed all hair and left the skin elastic and soft. In the park where the forest began, there was a strange shed, built into the rock and half underground, which probably had been used for storage. It had two chambers, one of which was large and round. The first job in converting this into a Turkish bath was to add a room for the stove and a steam room with 3 tiers of benches for gradually increased heat. Before the bathhouse was completed, Mr. Gurdjieff made temporary arrangements in the big round room, installing a stove, water pipes, a drainage system, and electricity, and so the first edition of the bath was ready for use. During the summer, our two chief cooks became tired, and one day Mr. Gurdjieff announced in the study house that the cooks were no good anymore and that he had to give the job to someone else. Can you imagine whom he appointed? Me. And he added that I would now be in charge of the kitchen. I did not wish to describe all my experiences during this period, and of course it did not last very long, as no work of this kind with Mr. Gurdjieff ever did. During the time I was cook, when I had to get up at 5 in the morning, I had also to play for movements after lunch, because Mr. Gurdjieff had in mind giving a demonstration of movements in a big theater in Paris, and work on it became very intensive. As the weather was quite hot, the piano was brought outside, and we rehearsed on a lawn. One day I played and played and played until my head fell forward on the piano, and I was fast asleep. I knew that in early December 1923, Mr. Gurdjieff hoped to have a demonstration. I orchestrated and copied the parts of a great deal of music for movements during the summer, but much remained to be done. One morning I went to the study house to find out what Mr. Gurdjieff intended to do. He was there and at once told me, "If you have nothing to do, fix the cracks in the wall." I worked some days at this, but then decided that I had better go on with orchestrating the music, as cracks could be fixed by anyone. Every evening, Mr. Gurdjieff created new exercises, and more music had to be composed. The demonstration took place at the end of December, and for 3 nights beforehand, I could not sleep at all. The difficulty of orchestration was increased because I had only 35 musicians instead of 100, the usual number for orchestral performances in the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. I could not use trumpets because, masking my few strings, they could have sounded blatant. I really had a feeling of satisfaction when, after the dress rehearsal, my great friend, the Russian composer Cherepinini, and his son, also a composer, told me how wonderful it sounded. The night before the dress rehearsal, all rugs, goatskins, mattresses, and even the fountains from the study house were brought to the theater. The foyer became an oriental palace. For the public, there were all kinds of Eastern delicacies, and the fountains were filled with champagne instead of water. Wow. Pupils who did not take part in the demonstration, among them an English diplomat, were dressed in costumes from The Struggle of the Magicians and stood at the entrance. The movements were much appreciated, but the greatest reaction was to the woman who walked around the stage with outstretched arms. The audience began to shout, "Enough, enough," because they could not understand how it was possible to maintain it for so long. When the demonstration ended, I asked Mr. Gurdjieff, "How did everything go?" He looked at me, smiling, but said nothing. That made me realize that in work of this kind, we do not seek words of praise or encouragement. We have to fulfill the task as best we can, and there should be no consideration for whether one is praised or not. That is the aim. Mr. Gurdjieff so often said, "Never think of results, just do." I would like to mention what took place during another demonstration when at the very end Mr. Gurdjieff shouted, "Stop!" Pupils on the stage held their postures, held them quite long. Then Mr. Gurdjieff had the curtain brought down, but did not say that the "stop" was finished. One of the pupils did not continue to hold the "stop" once the curtain came down, and Mr. Gurdjieff scolded her very strongly. He said that the "stop" had nothing to do with the audience or the curtain, that it is work and cannot be finished until the teacher says that it has to be held even if a fire should break out in the theater. After the demonstration, all of the carpets, fountains, and other things were taken back to the Prieuré, and movements began again in the study house. This demonstration was at the same time a preparation for a possible trip to New York. I say possible because until the last moment we did not know whether the money for the tickets would come or not. Mr. Gurdjieff had sent Mr. Orage and Dr. S. to New York in advance to make this trip possible. It was difficult to believe that it could take place because almost everyone who took part in the Paris demonstration was to go. The date of departure was fixed for the beginning of January, and Mr. Gurdjieff put my wife in charge of passports and clothing for all the pupils. Among the pupils going to America were not only Russian subjects with old Russian passports, but also Lithuanians, Armenians, and Poles, and all of their passports had to be registered and renewed at Melun near Fontainebleau, and not one of us at that time had a car except Mr. Gurdjieff. Everyone had to be taken to Paris and outfitted, in some cases literally from head to foot. Of course, it was not possible to consider individual taste or desire, but only to choose what was suitable for the purpose of the trip. Finally, the check from America arrived and the tickets were bought at once. Movements went on until the late evening. We left a good number of people in the Prieuré, and one person was put in charge during our absence. There was no time for my wife to buy a hat and a coat for herself, so Mr. Gurdjieff took her to Paris in his car the morning of the day of departure. I must mention an amusing incident in connection with the passports. They were given to each one personally. When the moment came to board the ship, one of the young women did not have her passport and said that she had put it in her trunk so as not to lose it. The trunks had been brought to the ship the day before, so we had to have the captain's permission to get it from the hold of the ship. We were all very happy to be going to America, and everyone, myself included, dreamed of triumphal demonstrations and the large profits so indispensable to Mr. Gurdjieff for carrying out his future plans. In fact, all those dreams were realized. We had an enthusiastic public. We gave many performances in different cities, but it all was so mixed with difficulties that finally our American trip began to seem like another crossing of the mountains. With Mr. Gurdjieff, the aim was not only a triumphal tour through America, but always work on everyday effort. In Essentuki, Mr. Gurdjieff had begun to give us exercises for this purpose, including the concentration of thought and some quite complicated ones with regard to breathing. I do not think I should write about them, and, besides, it could not be useful to just read about them, and Mr. Gurdjieff often warned us that exercises connected with breathing could even be harmful if they were not done in the proper way. For the same reason, he said not to repeat to others his personal talks with individuals, especially talks about breathing and sex energy. One feature that all the exercises have in common is that they require all our attention and so avoid the flow of uncontrolled associations that waste our life energy through very stupid, sometimes very painful, sometimes fantastic, sometimes erotic thoughts, feelings, and sensations, which we all more or less experience. Mr. Gurdjieff frequently said that intentional suffering and conscious labor, by reducing this unconscious flow of associations, could prolong life. For those who work on attention and use it in the struggle with associations, who do not to forget to remember themselves, for those people attention begins to be not only the center of life, but also the factor which lengthens it. I'm just going to reread that. One feature that all the exercises have in common is that they require all our attention and so avoid the flow of uncontrolled associations that waste our life energy through very stupid, sometimes very painful, sometimes fantastic, sometimes erotic thoughts, feelings, and sensations, which we all more or less experience. Mr. Gurdjieff frequently said that intentional suffering and conscious labor, by reducing this unconscious flow of associations, could prolong life. For those who work on attention and use it in the struggle with associations, who do not forget to remember themselves, for those people, attention begins to be not only the center of life, but also the factor which lengthens it. We sailed to New York on the Paris, at the time the largest French liner. We all had very comfortable second-class cabins and excellent food. Mr. Gurdjieff had a first-class cabin, as he had promised to give a demonstration of movements as a benefit for the crew. The ship's purser allowed our company to use freely the first-class public rooms, but all the trip was not to be as smooth as the start. Soon the sea began to be very rough, and by 7 o'clock the first night, most of the passengers, including our pupils, began to be ill and did not appear for dinner. My wife and I did not feel very well, but as we wished to stay with Mr. Gurdjieff, we struggled not to give in, but to overcome the nausea. Later, during this and other trips, we stood stormy weather very well. It was one of the worst crossings the ship had had. Even the big mirror in the drawing room was cracked. The following days were spent in visiting all our sick people who were not able to enjoy the advantages of this trip and could swallow nothing but orange juice. But the day before our arrival, the weather changed and the sun came out. Mr. Gurdjieff ordered everyone to rehearse movements because the demonstration on the boat was to take place in the evening. When I went on deck, I saw a crowd of people watching something with eager curiosity. It was our pupils practicing movements. During the day, we had a real rehearsal in one of the salons, and after dinner, we gave a demonstration before all passengers. The evening began with one of the pupils explaining in a few words the aim of the movements. Then my wife sang the bell song from Lakme, which Mr. Gurdjieff particularly liked. The movements performed were nearly all those which had been given in the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris. At the end, Mr. Gurdjieff, who sat in the first row, shouted, "Stop!" and the audience was amazed to see the pupils achieve this in spite of the ship's rolling, which was so extreme at one point that the piano slowly but steadily slid from one side of the stage to the other, myself following it on my chair. Wow. The following morning we arrived in New York. The personnel of the ship had been very attentive to all of Mr. Gurdjieff's pupils when they had been so ill. But no one had any money for tips. However, when Orage and some other people came on board to meet Mr. Gurdjieff, this problem was quickly resolved. The photographer took pictures of Mr. Gurdjieff saluting America with his Astrakhan hat in hand. This photo, in which the face of Mr. Gurdjieff has a profoundly inner expression, exists. There is another photo of him sitting with his dogs and cats. All his goodness and kindness, even towards animals, shows clearly. We saw him like this very often in the old days. When all formalities were over, Mr. Orage took Mr. Gurdjieff, my wife, and me to the Hotel Ansonia, while someone else took the pupils to another hotel. Having settled in our rooms, Orage took us to the restaurant for lunch. The roast beef had a funny bluish shade. It was surely frozen meat, and Mr. Gurdjieff avoided it. Afterwards, we always bought chickens or meat from Jewish butchers because they never eat frozen meat. When during the day some journalists came to see Mr. Gurdjieff and he took out his wallet, one of them admired its unusual oriental design. He asked Mr. Gurdjieff where he had got it, and Mr. Gurdjieff answered, "Do you like it?" and handed it to him, having taken out his money and papers. He explained to the journalist that in the Orient, if a guest expresses his admiration for something in the house of his host, the host always presents it to the guest. The journalist was quite stupefied. The next day, the question of finding a hall for a demonstration was raised, and at once difficulties began because not a single theater was free. The pupils had to rehearse, but where? Neither private hall nor schools, like those in Paris, were to be had. Finally, a possible hall was found, the Leslie Hall, near the hotel where the pupils were staying. On the second floor, there was a large hall, but for movements a stage was indispensable, so Mr. Gurdjieff had one quickly built by the pupils. We could have had much better conditions because the Moscow Arts Theater was just then in New York, and the artists and manager were very well known to me, as I had written music for them during our years in Tiflis. Mr. Gurdjieff knew all this, but for one reason or another he did not wish to change from Leslie Hall. The date of the first New York demonstration was fixed. The piano was carried up from the first floor. 2 days before, Mr. Gurdjieff asked me whether it would be possible to arrange the music for about 5 musicians. It had to be done, of course. After the orchestra of Champs-Élysées, although even there we had only 35 musicians, this seemed quite a pitiful number. To tell the truth, such an orchestra was not necessary at all, but nevertheless the violin, the cello, the double bass, the clarinet, and percussion played wonderfully. It was agreeable to be told by a musician from Moscow, a connoisseur of Oriental music, that all the music pleased him very much, and especially the melody that we called the goose. On the evening of the demonstration, the hall was filled with very elegant Americans. There were journalists and writers invited by Orage. Even the famous conductor Damrosch came. The whole program of Champs-Élysées was given. At the end of this very long performance, when the public began to leave, I wanted to speak with some of them, but I could not because Mr. Gurdjieff told me to play the music of The Fall of the Priestess, and he told the pupils to perform it not on the stage, but on the floor of the hall. It continued until all the public had left. That spoiled the evening for me, and I never understood the purpose. Later, we had several demonstrations in the neighborhood playhouse on Grand Street, which was loaned to Mr. Gurdjieff. In this same theater, an opera of Prokofiev was played one evening, and on another, some Hindu music. Mr. Gurdjieff asked me to go to listen to the Hindu music and write down the melodies. However, as time passed, there were fewer and fewer people in our audience, and we had no further prospects. Our food ration diminished day by day. So Mr. Gurdjieff decided to do what he had done in 1918. He told us that he had no money and that each one of us should look for work. Everyone decided to go to an agency in the morning. I offered myself as a musician, but only cooks were really in great demand. This very same day, everything changed. As soon as I came back from the agency, someone telephoned me. It was Mr. Bohm, one of the most eminent persons in the Imperial Ballet in Petrograd. Having had a great success with the Diaghilev ballet troupe, he had stayed in Chicago and opened a ballet studio there. He found me through the Moscow Arts Theater because he requested some of my music. I spoke to him about Mr. Gurdjieff, and he was at once very enthusiastic and asked to be introduced. As a result, Bohm not only offered his big studio to Mr. Gurdjieff for rehearsals, but also said he would help arrange a demonstration in a large theater in Chicago. Mr. Gurdjieff decided we would all go to Chicago. Soon our conditions again changed from very bad to very good. Before going west, Mr. Gurdjieff arranged demonstrations in Philadelphia and Boston to give us more practice. One of the important parts of the process at this point was the transmission of thought by means of music. A word was whispered by a person in the audience to one of the pupils in the hall, and the pupils on the stage had to guess the word. They also identified objects in the pockets of a person in the audience, names of operas, and and the music was played on the stage. Before all these experiments, it was announced that some would be real and others tricks. The public was invited to say which were which. This interested young people and students tremendously, but they were never able to understand how we did it. We had to find the cheapest way to get to Chicago. After many inquiries, I found an agency in Hoboken that gave us a low price. Mr. Gurdjieff, with my wife and Orage, went ahead to prepare everything for the arrival of the pupils, make the necessary contacts, interest the press, visit Boehm's studio, and so on. The French consul took a great interest in the demonstration and proposed that Mr. Gurdjieff give a kind of preview for his friends as advance publicity. My journey with all the pupils was not without difficulties. One episode makes me shiver whenever I think about it. Our route was through Niagara, and the pupils found out that we had the right to visit Niagara Falls and continue by the following train. I had a queer presentiment that we should not take time for this, although certainly Mr. Gurdjieff would not need us the day we arrived. I had great difficulty in persuading everyone to continue the trip and give up Niagara, but they accepted it as part of the work. When my wife met us at the Chicago station and said that we would have to perform before the French consul in 2 hours, everyone saw how right it had been not to interrupt the trip. The demonstration for the consul went well, and as a result it was decided to hire a very big concert hall, spacious as Carnegie Hall, with a stage as large as in Paris. Many people were at the performance, and both the movements and our tricks were well received. Returning from Chicago to New York, we gave a last demonstration in Carnegie Hall in the beginning of April 1924. The day of our departure for France approached. Mr. Gurdjieff told my wife on the last day that he needed me to stay with him in New York. As her presence was indispensable at the Prieuré, she was to go back with the pupils. My wife could not agree to this and asked Mr. Gurdjieff to decide which he needed more, her presence in the Prieuré or mine in New York. Mr. Gurdjieff was very displeased with her refusal, but in such a situation my wife could not be moved, and he knew it. During supper he told her that he preferred her in the Prieuré and that he would keep Madame G with him, so I could also return to France. Some hours before the departure, my wife found that there was not a single dollar left once the tickets had been bought. She went in haste to pawn one of her rings. It was the very one she once told Mr. Gurdjieff that she would never part with, because it was my mother's wedding ring. She asked Madame G to find her brother, who lived in New York, but was temporarily out of the city, and to ask him to redeem it. Madame G could bring it with her when she returned to the Prieuré. Later, Madame G, probably told by Mr. Gurdjieff about it, because he found money and redeemed it. We sailed back on a very nice ship, the Washington. The weather was splendid, and this time all our pupils were able to enjoy the good meals. When Mr. Gurdjieff came back, we learned that he had no money at all after we left, for it had gone for the pupils' tickets. He lived in two very small rooms and had practically nothing for food, but lectures by Mr. Orage and movements for Americans with Madame G had gone on, and soon money again was available. Mr. Gurdjieff and Madame G returned to France 2 months later in first-class cabins. Some of us met him in the station in Paris. Then everyone except my wife went back to the Prieuré by train. Mr. Gurdjieff asked my wife to wait and go with him by car. When they were in the car, he took out the ring I mentioned earlier and handed it to her. He said, "You should not have done it without telling me. Your brother might have forgotten or not redeemed it in time, and the ring would have been lost." She was very happy and was touched by Mr. Gurdjieff's words. When Mr. Gurdjieff entered the Prieuré gate, we were working in the courtyard. He got out of his car and looked at us with a very serious expression. We did not know then what awaited us.